The unexpected silence. It was a chilly autumn morning, and the hallways of Ridgeway High echoed with the usual blend of laughter, slamming lockers, and the squeak of sneakers on polished floors. Students moved in a hurry, clutching notebooks, trading jokes, and rushing to class before the bell rang. Everything felt ordinary until a sudden announcement crackled through the intercom. The principal's voice, usually steady and warm, sounded slightly strained as she instructed all classrooms to begin an immediate lockdown drill. At first, most students rolled their eyes, assuming it was just another practice, but the uneasy tone in her voice made a few heads turn. Teachers moved quickly, locking doors, dimming lights, and signaling students to gather in the corners. The once bustling school transformed into a place of unsettling stillness. The chatter stopped. The faint hum of the air conditioner and the creak of desks being dragged into place became the only sounds. For the first time that day, students noticed how loud silence could be, and an unspoken question spread through the room. Was this really just a drill? Whispers in the dark, the classroom grew heavier with each passing second. The teacher, trying to stay calm, held a finger to her lips and motioned for absolute silence. Students shifted uncomfortably on the cold tile floor, some hugging their backpacks tightly while others tried to steady their breathing. The fluorescent lights above flickered once, then steadied, but that brief flicker was enough to make hearts race. From the hallway, the faint sound of hurried footsteps echoed, followed by the metallic rattle of a door handle being tested somewhere down the corridor. No one dared to move. A girl in the back squeezed her friend's arm, her wide eyes glistening in the dim light, as if asking silently if this was still part of the drill. The air felt thick, and every tiny noise, a cough, a shoe squeak, the rustle of clothing, sounded like it might give them away. What unsettled them most wasn't what they could hear, but what they couldn't. The hallway fell into a silence so absolute that it felt unnatural, as if the building itself were holding its breath. The students exchanged nervous glances, and the unspoken thought began to spread among them. If this were just practice, why did it suddenly feel so real? The strange knock minutes ticked by, though to the students, it felt like hours. The clock above the whiteboard ticked loudly in the quiet room, each second echoing like a hammer strike. Everyone's eyes were fixed on the locked classroom door, as if expecting it to swing open at any moment. Just when the silence seemed unbearable, there came a soft knock. It wasn't loud, not even forceful, but it sent a chill down every spine. The knock came in 3 slow, deliberate taps, then nothing. The teacher froze in place, her hand hovering over her desk, not daring to move. Some students thought it might be a staff member checking rooms, but others felt a deeper unease. The knock hadn't sounded like someone in a hurry. It was too steady, too intentional. The teacher mouthed the words, "Stay quiet," her eyes darting toward the door, her face pale. No one breathed. Then, after another long stretch of silence, the knock returned, this time closer, as if it had shifted along the row of classrooms. Top, top, top. The sound traveled down the hall, pausing at each door, moving steadily away from them. Every ear strained to follow it until it vanished into the depths of the building. The students looked at one another in disbelief, silently questioning what they had just experienced. Was it part of the drill? If so, why did it feel like something no adult would have planned? The sound inside the room, the students sat frozen long after the last knock faded into silence. Some counted the seconds in their heads. Others kept their eyes locked on the door as if sheer focus could keep it sealed. Just when they began to think the unease might be passing, a faint sound stirred within the very room they were hiding in. It wasn't the shuffle of a restless student or the creak of a chair. It was softer, stranger, like the faint dragging of fabric across the floor. Every head turned toward the corner near the supply closet, but the dim light made it difficult to see. The teacher, trying to keep control, raised her hand again, though her trembling fingers betrayed her own fear. No one moved, but the sound continued, a gentle scrape, then a pause as though something was shifting deliberately just out of sight. A boy closest to the corner pressed his back harder against the wall, his eyes wide as though he'd seen movement, but he didn't dare speak. The silence grew so heavy that the smallest sound seemed amplified. A student's pencil rolled off a desk and clattered against the floor, causing several students to flinch at once. When the sound near the closet stopped abruptly after that, it left behind an even more chilling question. If nothing was supposed to be in the room with them, then what had just been moving? The breathing in the dark, the students huddled closer together, every pair of eyes fixed on the corner by the supply closet. The classroom felt smaller now, as though the walls themselves were inching inward. A deep, suffocating silence hung in the air, until it was broken by something far more unsettling than footsteps or knocks. From the darkened corner came the sound of breathing. It wasn't the steady rhythm of someone trying to stay calm, nor the panicked gasps of a student holding back fear. This breathing was slow, deliberate, and heavier than it should have been, as if whoever or whatever it belonged to wanted to be heard. The teacher's face went pale. She motioned to the class again, desperately signaling for stillness, though her own eyes shimmered with disbelief. A boy nearest to the sound covered his mouth, his chest rising and falling in shallow tremors as the breathing grew louder, then softer, like a tide rolling in and out. The room's air felt heavier with each exhale, thick enough that some swore they could almost feel it against their skin. No one dared whisper, but thoughts screamed silently in every head. Was someone hiding in here before the lockdown began? Or had something else found its way in when no one was looking? The breathing eventually stopped, but its absence was no comfort. It left the classroom in a silence that was sharper, colder, and infinitely more unbearable than before. When the presence answered, the classroom seemed to hold its breath after the heavy sound of breathing faded away. No one dared shift or even clear their throat, terrified that the slightest noise might invite attention. For a few minutes, the silence felt so deep that it became painful, pressing against their ears. That happened. A nervous student, trying to adjust his backpack without thinking, accidentally scraped the zipper against the tile floor. The faint metallic rasp sounded impossibly loud in the still room. Before anyone could glance at him, the corner answered. From the darkness came 3 soft taps against the wall, slow, precise, and deliberate, as though imitating the sound they had made. The students froze, their blood running cold. The boy who'd caused the noise pulled his knees to his chest, his eyes wide with terror. The teacher's hand shook as she raised it again, signaling desperately for silence, but her own breathing betrayed her fear. A second later, the sound repeated. 3 more taps, this time slightly louder, as if whatever was hidden wanted them to know it was listening. Every hair on the back of their necks stood on end. Some students buried their faces in their arms. Others stared unblinking at the corner, but not one of them dared to speak. What unnerved them most was not just that the sound had answered, but that it had responded in perfect rhythm, as though it understood them. The pattern on the wall of the classroom sat in a suffocating silence, the kind that seemed to press on their eardrums. No one moved, no one whispered. Every student's gaze stayed locked on the shadowed corner by the supply closet, waiting for the next sound. At first, the 3 taps that followed had seemed like a mimic, just an eerie coincidence. But when they came again and again, with the same pause between them, the realization spread like a shiver through the room. The taps were forming a pattern. Top, top, top. A pause. Top, top, top. Another pause. The rhythm was too exact, too precise to be random. Some students silently mouthed to one another, trying to guess if it meant something. A girl near the front pressed her hand against her friend's arm, as if to anchor herself, her eyes wet with fear. The teacher glanced toward the door, her lips trembling as though she was debating whether to break the lockdown rules and try to flee. But she stayed still, torn between duty and dread. Then, as if to prove itself aware, the tapping changed. It grew faster, sharper, hitting the wall in uneven bursts like it was spelling something out, an incomprehensible code that only it understood. Each strike echoed in the dark, vibrating through the floor, the desks, and their bones. By now, students weren't just scared of what was outside the classroom. They were terrified of what might be inside with them, trying to communicate in a language none of them wanted to understand. When the pattern stopped, the tapping continued in its strange, uneven rhythm until every student was too afraid to even blink. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than before, like the entire building had been swallowed by something vast and invisible. For a long moment, no one moved, hoping the stillness meant whatever was in the corner had gone. The teacher, her eyes fixed on the shadowed supply closet, raised her hand slowly and mouthed the words, "Stay calm." The students clung to that fragile thread of reassurance until something new unsettled them all. From the opposite side of the room, far away from the closet, came the faintest creak of a desk shifting. Every head whipped toward the sound. The desk was empty. No one sat there. No one had touched it, but it had scraped across the tile floor as if nudged by an unseen hand. Then, another sound followed, this time from the ceiling. A soft, dragging noise like fingertips tracing along the tiles above them. Students ducked instinctively, staring upward in disbelief. The sound traveled slowly, as if circling above the group, testing their reactions. A girl stifled a sob, burying her face in her sleeve, while another student clamped both hands over his ears as if that could block out the noise. The teacher pressed her back against the wall, her face pale, her body trembling, but still trying to appear strong. The room had become a stage, and something unseen was moving across it with purpose, shifting from one side to the other, reminding everyone that whatever they feared wasn't just outside in the halls. It was right there with them. The slow approach, the dragging sound above their heads faded, but the silence that replaced it felt almost worse. Students sat frozen, their bodies stiff, their eyes darting between the ceiling, the darkened closet, and the door that remained locked. For a brief second, it seemed like the presence might have gone, until the quiet was broken again, this time by the soft thud of something touching the floor. The sound was light, but deliberate, like a careful step being taken within the room. A boy near the front felt the vibration ripple faintly under the tiles, and his lips parted in silent terror. No one dared move, but their wide eyes followed the sound as it traveled, one soft thud at a time, closer to the cluster of students huddled together. The teacher raised her trembling hand again, signaling them not to panic, but even she pressed herself flatter against the wall, her knuckles white from gripping the edge of her desk for balance. Each step seemed unhurried, as though the unseen figure knew it had their full attention. One student, too afraid to contain himself, let out a muffled whimper. Immediately, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, slowly, a new sound began, just inches from where the student sat. It was faint, almost imperceptible, like the steady exhale of breath brushing against the room's heavy air. The realization spread through the group all at once. Whatever was in that room was no longer staying in the shadows. It was right beside them, testing how close it could come without being seen. The proof in the room, the students sat in paralyzed silence, each one straining to hear where the invisible presence might shift next. The faint breathing lingered for a moment, brushing against the still air like an invisible thread. Then, without warning, a desk at the far end of the room gave a low groan and scraped across the floor, moving several inches on its own. The sharp sound jolted everyone's nerves, and a few students gasped before clamping their hands over their mouths. The teacher's wide eyes followed the desk as it stopped in a crooked position, far from where it had been just minutes before. Before anyone could recover, another desk gave a sudden lurch, its metal legs squealing against the tile as it shifted half a foot closer to the group. This time, the movement wasn't gradual. It was swift, purposeful, as if something unseen had pushed it forward. A wave of cold air swept through the classroom next, so icy that students hugged their arms against their chests. The chill was unnatural, not like the usual draft from an air vent, but like a sudden pocket of freezing air that moved with intention, circling them. One girl's hair lifted slightly, as though caught in a current, even though the room was sealed shut. The collective realization sank in heavy and fast. Whatever had been knocking, tapping, and breathing was no longer content with staying hidden. It was making itself known, making sure they all understood that they were not alone. The fear was no longer just in their imagination. It was in every breath of cold air, every sound, and every movement around them. The presence closing in the desks had barely stopped moving when the air in the classroom grew even colder, heavy enough that students could see the faintest trace of their own breath drifting in the dim light. A low hum seemed to vibrate through the walls, so soft it was almost mistaken for the air conditioning, except the vents were silent. The hum deepened, pressing against their ears, until some students cupped their hands over them, wincing as though the sound were inside their skulls. Then, from the very center of the room, came a sharp clang, as if something metal had been struck, though there was nothing visible there. The sudden noise jolted several students, one of whom let out a small cry before being hushed instantly. That was when the temperature dropped further, a wave of icy air sweeping low across the floor, swirling around their legs like invisible water. The teacher, pale and trembling, silently mouthed for them to stay together, but even her steady authority was fading in the grip of fear. Then came the most terrifying moment yet. One of the backpacks, sitting unattended near the middle of the room, began to shift. First, it slumped over onto its side with a soft thud. Then, slowly, impossibly, it began to drag across the floor toward the dark corner of the supply closet. Every student watched in stunned disbelief, their chests tight with terror. The bag scraped inch by inch until it disappeared into the shadows, as though something had claimed it. The silence that followed was unbearable. No one moved, no one breathed. The message was unmistakable. Whatever was in that room wanted them to know it was real, and it was growing stronger. The lockdown ends, but not the fear just when the room's silence had reached its peak, when every student felt they could not endure one more second of stillness. The intercom suddenly crackled back to life. The principal's voice, calm and professional once more, announced that the lockdown was over and that classes could resume as normal. The words felt unreal, almost dreamlike, as though they belonged to a different world than the one inside that haunted classroom. The teacher hesitated, staring at the dark supply closet where the backpack had vanished, before finally unlocking the door. The hallway outside was filled with confused students emerging from other rooms, whispering nervously about what they had heard, or more importantly, what they hadn't. To them, the lockdown had been just another drill, long, intense, but uneventful. Only the students of that one classroom knew the truth. As they filed out in uneasy silence, a few dared to glance back. The desks remained in their shifted positions, proof that what they had experienced wasn't a shared imagination. Yet the backpack that had dragged itself into the shadows was no longer there. Some claimed they later saw it propped neatly against the wall by the closet, as if nothing had happened. Others swore it never returned at all. The teacher avoided every question, her lips pressed tightly together, her eyes betraying that she too had no explanation. For the rest of the day, none of the students could concentrate. The ordinary sounds of school, the squeak of shoes in the hallway, the bang of a locker door, the rattle of pipes above, suddenly carried a sinister edge, like echoes of the presence that had stalked them in the dark. Even after the final bell rang and they went home, the memory clung to them. The cold air, the breathing, the dragging bag, and the invisible watcher that had moved so close. The lockdown had ended, but the unease had not. Each student carried the same unspoken question in their mind, one that would haunt them for years to come. If that wasn't part of the drill, then what exactly was trapped in the room with them?